Good afternoon, everybody. This is All Things Chess with Cybertal. I am Cybertal. We're getting into our first real examination of hanging pawns. Yesterday we did sort of a general definitional summary and roundup of concepts. Today we're finally getting into how to fight with the hanging pawns. And then, of course, we'll move on to examining how to fight against the hanging pawns. But we'll start with fighting with. We're going to start by looking through a very classic game. This was played in the 1914 Petersburg Invitational Preliminary Tournament. This was a game between Nimzowitsch and Nimzowitsch-Tarrasch. These were two gentlemen that seems like they were born to disagree with each other. Tarrasch was sort of the old school redoubt against crazy modern chess, a defender of classical principles as he has understood them. And Nimzowitsch, he was the hypermodern vagabond who came up with all these exotic ideas and fought against the established redoubts of chess. Now, of course, we basically see that they were both sides of the same coin. They were both right. They just had different interpretations of chess. We now take the hypermodern ideas for granted. They're just a completely valid part of chess. But their disagreements, other than making each other a very reliable enemy, they advance chess greatly. Just like any other argument, philosophical or otherwise, you get the most advancements when there's great tumult and furor and disagreements. It sort of weeds out the garbage and brings forth the most valuable. But because they had that rivalry, their games were always incredibly interesting and filled with dynamic chess. Nimzowitsch was white here. This is before he really formulated his hypermodern openings. So he was still playing normal chess. So he played d4. Knight f3. I always like to bring it up. Back in the old days, they didn't play c4. They went with knight f3 instead. The reason why some people avoided c4 is because they were afraid of the Alban counter gambit, which is this. And then white has a couple different moves from here. To modernize, this is sort of strange and funny. If I knew my opponent was going to play the Alban counter gambit every time I played 1d4, I would play 1d4 for life. With Modern Eyes, we just see white winning a pawn here. He has to defend, but I think most modern theory has the Alban counter gambit as being semi-correct at most. White should be very glad to face this. But they were more afraid of romantic openings back in the day than otherwise, so they played knight f3 just to tamp down on the activity. c5. So Tarrasch was a defender of the classical Steinitzian principles. The one place where he really disagreed with Steinitz was on isolated pawns. Steinitz saw any pawn weakness like that as a negative for the position. Tarrasch saw an isolated d-pawn as an outright strength. He loved the activity that it gave and the open lines and the attacking chances. One of Tarrasch's most famous commandments is that a passive position held the germs for defeat. And this was a huge departure from Steinitz, because Steinitz held that a passive but weakness-free position wasn't yet anything to worry about, whereas Tarrasch recognized that a passive position, even without weaknesses, is incredibly dangerous. So he definitely took the isolated pawn side of the argument. He loved playing with isolated pawns. That's why the defense against the Queen's Gambit is called the Tarrasch defense, because he more or less invented it. Now we see the modern truth is somewhere in the middle. We don't see the isolated pawn as a plus or a minus. We see it weighing the pluses and minuses objectively rather than making a sweeping dogmatic statement one way or the other. But I would say of the two poles, I sort of lean towards Tarrasch the most. You should always play as aggressively and dynamically as you possibly can. That at least practically leads to the most success. But c5, this basically locks us into one side or the other getting an isolated pawn. c4, e6, e3. This is a very passive move. This just wouldn't be played in modern theory. There's no reason to lock this dark square bishop in. This leads to something called the Caissaic, more called the Zuckertort. Modern theory doesn't think that's a dangerous open at all. And some of it has to do with that dark square bishop. There's no reason to view this passive. The modern way of playing, this would be the main line of the Tarrasch. And then g3. G3 was a line more or less invented by Akiba Rubinstein to face the Tarrasch defense. Akiba Rubinstein was one of the founders of modern chess. If not for g3, I think the Tarrasch would be far more popular, but g3 is the most reliable way to fight for an advantage against the Tarrasch. the latest analysis of the Tarrasch does have some methods of trying to get to equality, and I trust the analysis that says that it can get equality. But it's very difficult. G3 is, in modern eyes, a fairly pleasant way to play against the Tarrasch. But E3, this is just way too passive. F3, Bishop D3. This is definitely a move that modern theory wouldn't play. In all of these Queen's Gambit positions for both sides, the battle for the tempo is a big deal. And that tempo is, if black moves his bishop first, white can take on c5 and gain time. If white moves his bishop first, black can take on c4 and gain time. You don't want to go overboard in trying to save that tempo, but just giving it away up front is typically giving away too much of the game. Knight c3, it's just a much better move. It just saves the time, it continues development, so you're not really losing anything. Yeah, just better move. And this is of course the benefit of hindsight of modern theory and training. You know, these were geniuses, but this is back in 1914 where they just knew so much less about chess than we do. You know, there are A players today that know more about chess than Aaron Nimzowitsch knew in 1914. Just because we know so much more, and there's so many more training methods and so much more stored knowledge. We all stand on the shoulders of giants. And that goes with any field of knowledge. We just accumulate more and more as we go along. But just aside. Bishop d3, not a great move. Knight c6, black should just immediately win the tempo. And one potential line is... And this should look familiar because this is a mainline Queen's Gambit accepted, but black is just up a tempo. Because usually here, and I'll just go to the position just to clarify it. It's the exact same position, but it's white to move here, whereas in the other line, after castles, it's black to play. So this is just a direct tempo loss for white, and in a somewhat sharp position as well. These isolated queen pawn positions are quite sharp and concrete, where a loss of a tempo is just that. It's just lost time. Black should be at least equal here. That loss of a tempo is important. So knight c6, not necessarily bad, just the alternative is much better. Castle, again, he shouldn't be allowing this loss of tempo. He should play... If he wants to try for a nice hanging pawn, he should play b3 here. Probably just the best moves to take there. And then we get to... an isolated pawn, and this is a position that's filled with content. It's probably balanced, because in these positions, the bishop doesn't really belong in d3. It should be on e2 to break the coming pin with bishop g4. But I think it is better than losing the tempo. So castle, again, bishop d6, not only does it not gain that tempo, but it puts him at risk of losing his own tempo. Dx c4 is just, again, it's that same line where you're up a tempo on a Queen's Gambit accepted. Bishop d6. b3, again, they're both playing for the schematic of the Caissaic retort, where you support the c pawn with the b pawn, and you bring your bishop to b2. He is missing better moves here. Probably c takes. And here, white's in time to stop the pin with bishop g4 with h3. And it's a good dynamic position. This is a good isolated queen pawn for black. All of his pieces are reasonably placed. But this would be a better choice in the game, I think. After b3, black just doesn't have any problems. Castles, again, benefit of modern hindsight. This isn't accurate. Dx c4 is best. In this instance, it's white with the hanging pawns. And this will be a dynamic battle. I think this is equal, and this is going to be a very dynamic fight. The reason why castles is inaccurate, bishop b2 doesn't take advantage of it. I think cx d4 is a little bit better. And then this is a little bit less good. Again, the bishop is going to be coming to g4, where the bishop on d3 doesn't make as much sense. But in my opinion, it's a little bit better than bishop b2. But again, this is an equal position. It's easy to quibble with these moves with the benefit of modern hindsight. But b6, Knight b2. This is the first move with which we can say this is completely inaccurate. The knight literally can't move on d2. It's developing to a spot where it has no activity. It can only really activate once this knight moves away from f3. Much better would be just taking a d5. And then this reaches a similar structure to the game. Black has the hanging pawns, which we'll start looking at here soon, except the knight is much better on c3. It's just outright more active, and that's exactly what you want to go for, more or less in every position, but especially against hanging pawns. You want your pieces active and attacking the pawns on d5 and c5. On d2, it's just really passive. It just doesn't have anywhere to go. It's sitting there for the sake of sitting there. It's basically more or less a dead piece. On c3, it's hitting the d5 pawn. Another idea for these structures is that you can play knight a4 and then bishop a3 to attack the c pawn, followed by rook c1 to bring even more firepower. So file that away in your mental database. That a knight on c3, you can often bring it to a4 like it's a Nimzo-Indian to attack that c pawn. But on d2, it's just simply sitting there for the sake of sitting there. This is a passive piece. Bishop b7, cx d4 is another valid way. This is just a super-duper equal position. I prefer the game choice just because it keeps more winning chances on the board. It keeps all the tension in the position. Rook c1, again, it's easy to quibble with the benefit of modern hindsight. We don't know yet if the rook belongs on c1. With the knight on c3, the rook on c1 would make a lot of sense, because you'd have knight a4 to continue to pressure that c pawn. But without that resource, the rook can often just end up sitting there not doing much. Cx d5 is fairly standard. And then rook e1. This is a standard defensive maneuver in these positions for the side facing the hanging pawns. The rook clears out the f1 square. You can either play bishop f1 and then g3. You create that fianchetto and then fill it. The fianchetto helps block out the strong dark square bishop. Or you can drop the knight back to f1, and that helps cover the kingside as well. But this rook e1 move is standard to help clear out that f1 square for either of those minor pieces. This is an equal position. That knight on d2 just doesn't make sense. It might even be, knight f1 would be a good choice. It might even make sense to play knight b1, just omit the error. But this looks about equal, and this is going to be a good fight to come. But rook c1, we don't know if the rook belongs there or not. Queen e7, developing. Ex d5. So this reaches our hanging pawn structure. Just a quick note, knight x d5 avoids the pawn weakness, but it comes at a huge cost. One option is this. And white has a simple but very strong advantage. He has the bishop pair in an open position. These bishops are absolutely raking the kingside. This is a very favorable position for white. And since it's a symmetrical position, he's playing for two results only. Black has no compensation for that missing bishop pair. And in an open position like this, that bishop pair is extraordinarily strong. But ex d5 is plenty strong, and it leads to a fairly favorable hanging pawn structure. Knight h4, this is an amusing move. Nimzowitsch was a very creative player. Sometimes his creative flights of fancy took him places that he shouldn't go. He was too busy wondering whether he could or not. Never stuck past whether he should or not. Part Jeff Goldblum. But invoking the move g6 from black isn't a gain, and it doesn't compensate for the loss of time. So g6, again, this is just a waste of time from whites. The move g6 doesn't necessarily accomplish anything in this position. Rook a8, common sense development, excellent choice. Dx c5. Practically, I think this is a mistake from white, even if it's objectively okay. I think bishop b5 is a better choice here. Me too. This prepares to try to eliminate one of black's strong bishops, the way they're lined up against the kingside. You want to be sort of proactively neutralizing that. Reason why I wouldn't want to take in c5 is that this is a very favorable hanging pawn structure for black. And this will be an opportunity for us to go into the basics of hanging pawns a bit more. So the main question is, what makes a favorable hanging pawn and what makes an unfavorable hanging pawn? So when you have the hanging pawns like this, you want to aim for harmonious development. Well, All of black's pieces are developed except for the rook on f8. It's got a very natural post on e8, so he has very harmonious development. All of his pieces make sense. You know, these bishops are lined up against the king side. Very favorable. This knight can be active. It can hop to b4 to harass that bishop. All of his pieces have common sense posts, and they're very active. When you have the hanging pawn, you want to check to see whether the side playing against has counterplay. So ideally, when you go into a hanging pawn structure, when white makes this choice to go into this position, you want immediate pressure against the hanging pawns. You want ways of pressuring these. None of white's pieces are set up to attack these at all. If you could magically teleport this knight to a4, it would be grim on the rim, but then you'd have a threat of bishop a3 to pressure that pawn. Then you would have a hope of pressuring these potential weaknesses. But none of white's minor pieces are set up to pressure those pawns. Again, that's sort of the drawback of that knight bd2 move that he made earlier. It looks sort of pretty, but it didn't make sense within the structure that we were heading for, which is this hanging pawn structure. So none of white's pieces are set up to pressure these hanging pawns. White doesn't have any pawn breaks. Sometimes in fighting hanging pawns, you want to either achieve b4 or e4 to try to break up these pawns from standing next to each other, controlling all the squares. White is nowhere near either of those moves. So white doesn't even have counterplay through a pawn break, trying to break these pawns up. So, more or less, this is about as favorable a hanging pawn as you can get. I would say white's only slightly worse here, but I would say black is definitely a little bit better, just because he has all this activity and chances for a successful attack. And white just doesn't have any pressure on these hanging pawns. When you make the choice to transpose to a hanging pawn structure, you want more or less immediate pressure against the hanging pawns. If you can't achieve that immediate pressure, you want to think long and hard whether you actually want to go for a hanging pawn structure. Because typically, the side with the hanging pawns, if they're playing correctly, will get so much activity because they're open lines for their rooks and their minor pieces that you need either immediate play or extraordinarily solid defenses. So I definitely at least prefer black practically, but I think black is objectively slightly better. Bishop b5, knight e4, the knight goes to its strong outpost. Bishop c6, this is extraordinarily dangerous. When you are back on your heels, giving your opponent the bishop pair, especially a bishop pair that's already lined up against your king, is very, very dangerous. It absolutely comes to be in this game. Again, rook e1 is a standard move in these positions. You want to clear that square out to either drop your bishop back to f1 and play g3, or drop your knight to f1 so the knight can help shore up the king side. Bishop c6 is just too soft. It's giving up the bishop pair for no good reason at all. Bishop c6. Queen c2. This just doesn't achieve anything. Again, if there are a way to pressure this pawn on c5, the queen c2 move might be meaningful. But here, the queen it's sitting there for the sake of sitting there. Moreover, it brings itself farther away from the king side. So white's taking all of his pieces away from the king side at a time when a lot of black's pieces are already lined up for the attack. Again, rook e1, standard defensive move here. 7, bishop a1. This gives white some offensive ideas, maybe queen c2 and queen b2 at some point. And here, queen c2 is okay because we have knight f1 as a defensive resource. White's definitely worse here. You know, black's got the bishop pair, he's got the strong knight in e4. But white still has defensive chances. Black would like to play f5, but that would bring that incredibly dangerous bishop to life. So black will always, or nearly always, be stuck with this sort of awkward pawn on f6 to block the long diagonal. So black is better, for sure, but white still has decent defensive chances here. Whereas queen c2, knight xd2. So we're just clearing pieces away for the successful kingside attack. Knight xd2, and then the next move, whatever position you're in, especially hanging pawns, but in general, you want to look to your pawn breaks. And again, a pawn break, d4, this is the best move here. A pawn break is when you bring your pawn in contact with an enemy pawn to either capture or be captured for the sake of opening the position up. Your pawn breaks are the engines of your play. It causes structural changes and open things up your pieces. You always want to be analyzing your pawn breaks, and in hanging pawns, when you have them abreast like this next to each other on d5 and c5, just like isolated pawn, you want to be looking at d4 the entire time. Check to see whether that move is accurate. A lot of times that'll be the engine for unleashing all of the activity in the position. And here it's completely decisive. This is a crushing move for black. EXD4. This completely overlooks everything. This just sort of gives up. Now, but this was back in 1914. So the idea of the sacrifice that was about to come, it had only been seen a couple times before. I believe the first time on record was Bauer-Lasker. I think it was 1890 something. I'll look it up and put it in the comments of this video. But this was still a fairly new tactical idea. So EXD4, it's bad with modern eyes, but again, we have the benefit of knowing so much more than the great players before us. G3 was mandatory to block off that diagonal. Bishop A8's a little bit more accurate. Black can take the pawn. But this is actually surprisingly hard to win for black. White has definite counterplay, and I think black is certainly still better. You know, he's got the bishop pair, he has an extra pawn, the white king is still exposed. But black's got some weaknesses here, and white's got the e-file that he can use as a resource. This isn't really simple at all, whereas bishop A8 keeps control of the position. Knight C4. And black has an excellent position here. He's got the bishop pair, he's got a very strong passed pawn, he's got the weakened white king to go against. But this can still work for white. He's got this very strong knight on c4, which almost by itself just gives him excellent defensive chances. This is still a fight, whereas after EXD4, this just allows the parade fireworks to go off. So bishop x h2. This is the most forcing variation. Bishop x g2 is a little bit more accurate, but it's sort of a quibble. Both are extraordinarily strong. Queen g5. Notice how all of white's pieces are just completely walled off from the king side. It doesn't matter that black is down a piece here, because all of white's material is completely far away from the king side. Black's got that queen and the bishop for the attack. White has literally nothing for defense, so it doesn't matter that black is down a piece here. King f3, and king h1, queen f4, with devastation. On king f3, rook fe8, this is a lovely little quiet move. Just cuts the king off from running away, and there's nothing that white can do here. Just gets the piece back, he's already up material, and he has a continuing mating attack. This is completely over. So bishop x g2 is a little bit more decisive, but this is still perfectly fine. This is winning for black as well. Bishop x g2, just this double bishop sacrifice, you always want to keep in mind. Go back to the basic position. Whenever you have hanging pawns and you have your bishops lined up like this, especially when all the white's done a very poor job of arranging his minor pieces for defense of the king's side, this is a tactical theme that you want to be thinking about. d4 followed by a bishop sacrifice to open up the king's side. That's just that sacrifice that needs to be mnemonically stamped into your pattern-seeking abilities. When you have hanging pawns, it's sort of kill or be killed. It's sort of like isolated pawn. You have to play aggressively, or else long-term, those will just be weaknesses that can be focused down. And here, black has just the perfect position to continue ripping away. f3, if the king takes, rook comes, and then white has to shed material. And then black also picks up the knight in d2. This is just completely gone. White can't use any of his trumps because the white king is so exposed. So f3, rook fe8. This is completely correct. Mobilization over material. When you have an attack like this, material doesn't matter anymore. Going after the king matters the most. If just an example, if black wastes a move to pick up that material, and all of a sudden black is still better here, but this is a fight. White suddenly has decent drawing chances. Whereas after rook fe8, he's just continuing to mobilize. All of white's pieces are still completely walled off from the king's side. Strike while the iron is hot. Keep ripping away and mobilizing what pieces you've got for the kill. 94. Bishop x1. So now we take the time to take it because queen h2 will be a threat after the rook takes. Here's an example. Rook x, and then the queen's hanging. If queen d1, and this is a humiliating position. You know, white can resign this. Material doesn't matter here, but black already has two pawns for his piece, but this is just absolutely crushing. d5, f5. So we're sort of in the zone where this is just the prettiness of the kill. Rook x e4. About this move, Tarrasch intoned, chess, like love, like music, has the power to make men happy. Get off your patriarchy, sir. Women can feel that way too, but I completely agree. f4. Queen g3 is more efficient, and it's actually a little bit surprising that Tarrasch missed this because after f4, it's like mate in, I think it was 6 moves? 4 moves. Whereas queen g3, just a very direct and easy maneuvering mate. It was theorized by some that Tarrasch chose this to torture Nimzowitsch a little bit more because of their personal animosity towards one another. I highly doubt that, but I wasn't there, so I can't possibly tell you. But f4 wins as well. f8. And this is just a beautiful piece of geometry. So bishop b5 mates. All of black's pieces are just working perfectly together. This is incredibly efficient. All of the squares are only controlled once. Lovely mate. Absolutely beautiful finish. So the key to the game, as usual, is much earlier. So both sides made some errors in the middle game opening and middle game struggle. Most severe, and this is the one I want to highlight from the opening, knight bd2 is just an outright error here. When you're in these structures heading towards a hanging pawn, piece activity is incredibly important. This knight does nothing on d2. c3 is just, I mean, best would probably be to take and then play knight c3. Because when you're playing against the hanging pawns, you want to find ways for your minor pieces to start generating pressure against those pawns. If you never generate pressure against those pawns, the side with the hanging pawns is just going to continue to develop and push for a kingside attack. You can't just passively sit back and let your opponent build for an attack. You have to start generating pressure against those hanging pawns. On d2, that knight is almost worse than useless in generating pressure. It sort of clogs up the d file as well. And then as the game progressed, white was just basically planless the whole time. There's just no... White never even tried to generate pressure against the pawns. When you're playing against the hanging pawns, you either need to be setting up your defenses, make yourself a little bit more solid with the thematic rook e1, or trying to generate pressure against the hanging pawns actively. White just sort of hung around making moves. You can't be neutral on a moving train. The side with the hanging pawns is going to be pushing for an attack and developing. You've got to build up your pressure, or you've got to build up your defenses. Just hanging there in the middle, doing nothing, will get you killed. And that's exactly what happened. Again, when you're playing with the hanging pawns, d4 is the key move you want to be looking for constantly, whether it's a pawn sacrifice or not. When you have your bishops lined up against the enemy kingside like that, especially, d4 is just like the isolated pawn positions. That pawn break is the one you want to be looking for constantly. Pawn breaks are the engine and the soul of your play. You just need to look for it constantly. And here, it just rips open the position where black gets an easy knockout blow. So, absolutely beautiful game. It's very thematic of these sorts of positions, so we're going to be looking at a few more games like this. The side with the hanging pawns always has to play aggressively, so the games playing with the hanging pawns are going to be fairly beautiful and tactics heavy, so it'll be fun to look at least. We'll continue on tomorrow with those. Until then, my name is John. I'll see you then.